How has my worldview changed since taking Teaching for Truth and Reconciliation this summer? Well, first of all, I now have a greater awareness of Canada's history. I have a better understanding of the history of colonization that affected the past and the present. I can see that Canada has curated an innocent view of itself. We are, after all, known as the peacekeeping, sorry saying, beaver tail loving, sweet little cousin of the United States. Something that Chelsea Vowell writes has totally shifted my perspective of Canada's history. She says, at least in the United States, they admit slavery happened. In Canada, many still seem to think there was no enslavement here, believing only that Canada was a shining station on a glorious underground railroad. So my eyes have been open to the fact that slavery existed in this country and many more atrocities, including the persistent and often legalized terrorism of Indigenous peoples. This class completely enlightened me to vehicles of abuse like the doctrine of discovery, which justified the exploitation, murder, and enslavement of Indigenous people in the name of Christian so-called evangelism. This class taught me about the Indian Act, which I did not know of before at all, which has been an invasive and paternalistic federal law that attempts to regulate and control the lives of quote-unquote registered Indians and reserve communities. A law that has attempted to impose governing structures over the rights of Indigenous peoples to practice their cultures and traditions. A law that ridiculously tries to define who qualifies as Indian in the form of quote-unquote Indian status. Before this class, I had no idea about the fact that treaties have not been honored or followed in the spirit that Indigenous peoples agreed to. One of the lessons we listened to in our class titled Trick or Treaty revealed that the Douglas Treaties abolished Indigenous land title according to the British, whereas Indigenous leaders understood these arguments to be peace treaties and not land purchases. This class has revealed to me that these practices of manipulating Indigenous people to sign away their rights still exists present day. I remember reading in Vowell that the Canadian government has been steadily eroding treaty rights since 1982. Well, before this class, I was exposed to some of the horrors that occurred in residential schools. This class really revealed the gravity of the situation by highlighting that there were 130 residential schools in Canada and that they existed for 165 years. This class revealed to me that that was 165 years of sexual abuse, physical abuse, and cultural genocide. That's generations of trauma and forced assimilation. Before this class, I did not know that it was literally the government's mission to erase the quote-unquote Indian problem. Prior to this class, I valued being non-judgmental, realizing that people make choices based on many factors, including generational traumas. This class has solidified that perspective. Through this class, I've also a new understanding of how colonized my Christianity is. I can see that not only in the way I worship corporately, but also in the way I do quote-unquote outreach. I've been made aware of my savior complex. My outlook on serving has shifted from what can I do for you to may I hear you, may I see you, let's share our thoughts and ideas. You are valued as equal. Instead of me making room at my table, let's make a new table together. I was challenged to think of spirituality in a less Gnostic way. I can now see there are many similarities between Indigenous spirituality and my own. I can now see that practices such as smudging are tools of healing and prayer, and taking part in them does not contradict my own beliefs or values. This class has opened my mind and heart to understanding and valuing the beliefs of others, and in particular, different Indigenous values. The 7 sacred teachings and the medicine wheel have demonstrated to me that Indigenous people have intentionally built their lives around ideas like family connectedness, cooperation, kindness, stewardship, and respect. And these are simply the same teachings of Jesus. I did not realize how similar Christian and Indigenous values were. As an elementary school teacher, I have learned that the way I introduced Indigenous peoples to my students in the past was objectifying, pan-indigenizing, and quite honestly irrelevant. From the knowledge I've gained in this class, I believe that in some small way I can play a role in seeking truth and reconciliation by teaching my students about the accurate history and present effects of colonization, oppression, and forced assimilation in this country, sharing the reality of residential schools and listening to the voices of survivors and thrivers, understanding the Indigenous worldview, celebrating the resiliency of Indigenous peoples, discovering and appreciating, not appropriating, the many different cultures, communities, languages, and nations within what we call Canada. I no longer look at Indigenous education as a unit in social studies, but as an integrated thread in all areas of learning. Learning about Indigenous peoples will no longer be a study of their historical dress, foods, and lodging. It will be about understanding their worldview, sacred teachings, and spiritual practices. Students will come to connect with Indigenous people, recognizing that our Christian perspective aligns in many ways with Indigenous values like stewardship, respect, and cooperation. The greatest revelation for me in this class is that I am not called to simply feel guilty. I am called to educate myself and others. I am called to amplifying the voice of Indigenous peoples. I am called to recognize and respect the ownership, control, access, and possession of Indigenous information, knowledge, experiences, and stories. I am called to credit Indigenous peoples for their time and knowledge. I am called to hold others accountable when they are displaying oppressive behaviors towards Indigenous peoples. I am called to vote according to those who have Indigenous interests as a priority. I am called to do more research beyond this class, like knowing more about the different First Nations and Métis people in Canada, and knowing more about cultural protocols and traditions. I am called to build relationships with Indigenous peoples based on mutual consent and trust. I am called to listen carefully to Indigenous voices and stories at events in the arts, in film, in music, and so on. I am called to the lifelong process of truth and reconciliation.